In the mysterious realm of scientific exploration, an unprecedented virus has emerged quietly, like a double-edged sword. It doesn't bring disaster that destroys life, but rather an eerie transformation that rewrites the rules of life. Those infected are not only free from illness and suffering, but also gain astonishing superhuman self-healing and immunity abilities. Just how powerful is this immunity? Even AIDS, which modern medicine struggles to tackle, and dozens of other incurable diseases, are easily neutralized by it, yet fate's gift has long been priced in the dark. Those infected with this virus will gradually transform into terrifying monsters, overwhelmed by aggression, as if controlled by primitive animal instincts, and at the same time, they develop a fear and aversion to sunlight. Once exposed to ultraviolet rays, their bodies burn like kindling set ablaze, quickly scorching until they turn to ash. The origin of the story dates back to a biological expedition team from the United States, who stepped into the depths of Bolivia's mysterious jungle, filled with unknown dangers. In a hidden corner of the jungle lies a damp and dark karst cave, like a gateway to another world. A few months earlier, an American biological laboratory received a piece of secret intelligence. A mysterious biologist claims to have discovered an unprecedented life form in this cave in Bolivia. Like a miracle in the river of time, this life form had survived for at least 500 years, and astonishingly, it possessed a natural immunity to numerous viruses. The intelligence also stated that if scientists could successfully decipher the genetic structure of this life form, humanity might break free from existing physical limitations and achieve the long-cherished goal of immortality. Upon receiving the news, the biological laboratory immediately assembled an elite expedition team and dispatched it to the Bolivian cave. When the expedition team arrived at the mysterious cave, the sight before them greatly surprised them. The legendary and highly mysterious life form appeared to be nothing more than an ordinary human being, yet as their observation deepened, they realized he was far from ordinary. He did have a human appearance, but his actions and behavior showed no trace of human consciousness. Professor Fanning, a scientist, couldn't contain his curiosity and desire to explore, and was eager to step forward to examine the mysterious creature. Just as he was about to approach, a teammate beside him stopped him. At this very moment, the mysterious life form, which had been locked in a cage, took advantage of the moment the young man opened the cage door to rush out, opened its mouth wide, and pounced on Professor Fanning. Its speed was so fast that no one had time to react. Before Professor Fanning could even let out a cry of surprise, the mysterious life form bit his neck. The other team members were stunned for a moment, but years of training enabled them to react quickly. They pulled out their pistols one after another, and fired several shots at the mysterious life form. With a few gunshots, the mysterious life form collapsed to the ground and lost its life. But in doing so, they also lost their precious research subject. The most urgent matter now was to send the injured Professor Fanning to the hospital for treatment. Professor Fanning's injury was extremely horrific. The wound on his neck was a bloody mess, and, coupled with the fact that he had been bitten by this mysterious monster, everyone knew in their hearts that this injury would be extremely difficult to treat, and modern medical methods might not be able to help. People sighed secretly, thinking the odds were stacked against Professor Fanning. Yet fate is always full of dramatic twists. Professor Fanning didn't fall into a life-threatening state. On the contrary, his body began to undergo unimaginable changes. In just 2.5 days, the severe injuries on his body healed rapidly, as if he had never been injured at all. Professor Fanning himself was shocked by this miraculous change in his body. Just as he was immersed in this surprise, Professor Jason noticed blood in Fanning's mouth. Fanning reached into his mouth with his finger, and found that his teeth were starting to fall out. An inexplicable panic welled up in his heart. Time flew by, and in the blink of an eye, 3 years passed. In a biological laboratory in the United States, biologists from all over the world were holding a secret meeting about the new virus. More than a month ago, a brand new virus appeared in the primeval forests of Africa. In the early stages of infection, those infected would only cough and have a fever, no different from a common cold. But as the virus reproduced rapidly, severe internal bleeding would soon occur in the infected. In just a few weeks, a large number of infected people had died. Fortunately, under the strict control of governments around the world, the virus had not spread widely. But this method isn't a long-term solution after all. It only delays the spread of the virus. The only way is to develop a vaccine against the virus as soon as possible. And in the American Biological Laboratory, there happens to be a life form for their research. This life form is not only immune to the new virus, but can even make the human body stronger. Unbelievably, the life form the biologists are studying is Professor Fanning, who was bitten in the cave 3 years ago. Since being bitten by the unknown creature, Professor Fanning's body has undergone earth-shattering changes. His own immune cells fused with the cells of the unknown creature to form a brand new type of cell. This new type of cell is not only immune to various incurable diseases, but has even extended Professor Fanning's lifespan. But this cell also comes with a major drawback. the infected person's brain loses the ability to think independently. Now Professor Fanning is nothing but a walking corpse. Biologists have tried diluting the cells from Professor Fanning's body, and then injecting them into the bodies of death row inmates, but no matter how much they diluted the cells, the test subjects would turn into demented monsters, and these test subjects possess strong aggressiveness. The biologists named this experiment Project Noah. They discovered an exception. Test subject 11, Helen, after being injected with the new cells, she didn't undergo strong mutations. Although she had clearly lost her sanity, her appearance and behavior were no different from a normal human being, and even retained a trace of consciousness. Looking at the previous failed test subjects, Professor Park discovered that the only difference between test subject 11 and them was that she was still a young girl. Therefore, Professor Park reasonably deduced that the younger the test subject, the easier it is to achieve perfect fusion with the cells. Therefore, Professor Park suggested finding a child for the experiment. Catherine didn't quite agree with Professor Park's approach. Their test subjects are humans, not lab mice. How could they use a human child for an experiment? This is far too cruel for an innocent child. But Catherine's objection didn't receive support from the others. To stop the spread of the virus, the board of directors approved Professor Park's experiment application. After repeated screening, they finally found a girl named Amy in the slums. Amy's mother was a drug addict who had died from a drug overdose not long ago. Now Amy lives alone in an orphanage, making her the most suitable candidate for the experiment. After confirming the experiment candidate, Agent Brad led his team to the orphanage. Although Amy was a little girl, she had grown up in the slums since childhood. That place was a mix of good and bad people, and with her mother being a drug addict, Amy had dealt with all kinds of people. She quickly sensed something unusual. From Brad's conversation with the orphanage staff, Amy made an excuse to go back to her room to pack her things, but in reality, she took the opportunity to jump out of the window from the balcony and flee. But the young Amy was no match for the agents. She had just run to the corner when she was caught by Agent Jack. Seeing that Amy still tried to resist, Jack simply resorted to violence to make Amy stop struggling. Seeing this scene, Brad felt a bit conflicted. Amy was after all just an ordinary child. How could his colleague treat her like an animal? Not to mention that they were here to pick Amy up. Yet now it felt like a kidnapping. On the way back to the laboratory, Brad bought Amy some snacks and expressed sincere apologies for Jack's behavior. Under Brad's comfort, Amy gradually calmed down and began to ask where they were taking her. Brad hesitated for a moment and chose to tell her the truth. Surprisingly, after learning that she was going to be sent to the laboratory, Amy didn't show any resistance. Perhaps she herself was well aware that a child with no family and no money like her going to the laboratory would have more value than staying in the orphanage. On the way, they passed by an amusement park. Seeing the fleeting look of surprise on Amy's face, Brad couldn't bear it. He pulled the car over to the side of the road and took Amy into the amusement park, and even taught Amy to shoot. After teaching her once, she hit the jackpot. Halfway through their play, Brad received a call from his ex-wife Lisa. Lisa said she was about to remarry soon, and hoped Brad could come to her wedding. Upon hearing the news of his ex-wife's remarriage, Brad could not help but fall into memories. In fact, he and his ex-wife had loved each other deeply. The reason for their separation was that Brad had caused the death of their young daughter. Due to a mistake in the past, Lisa couldn't forgive Brad for what he had done and chose to separate from him. And looking at Amy in front of him, his own daughter would be the same age as her if she were still alive. Thinking of this, Brad couldn't bear to send Amy to the laboratory anymore. It turned out that all test subjects of Project Noah were brought back by Brad. Although Brad didn't know what the biologists in the laboratory were researching, he often heard heart-wrenching screams coming from the laboratory. Obviously, the test subjects were having a hard time. After thinking repeatedly, Brad decided to escape with Amy. He took advantage of the gap when his colleague went to the bathroom, choked his colleague Jack from behind and knocked him unconscious. After putting him down, he found Amy and explained the situation to her, then took Amy and left the amusement park. But Brad had seriously underestimated the power of the laboratory. Shortly after he left the urban area, he sought his own wanted notice on TV. Brad knew that it would be difficult to escape the laboratory's arrest with his own strength alone, so he had to find a way to seek help from the outside. Brad contacted his ex-wife and asked her to help contact the TV reporter, hoping the reporter would expose the reason why he had escaped with Amy. With the media's intervention, the misunderstanding would presumably be resolved. But unexpectedly, the laboratory had already traced to his ex-wife's house. Fortunately, his ex-wife reacted quickly and didn't reveal their conversation. After hanging up the phone, Brad thought for a moment and went to the police station to surrender himself. But while waiting for the reporter, the police station was surrounded by a large number of agents. Realizing that something was seriously wrong and that he had been exposed, Brad snatched the opponent's service pistol and took a policeman nearby as a hostage. But unexpectedly, those agents actually killed the hostage in order to catch him. Brad was also an agent by background, so his reaction skills were still sharp. But just as he killed the other agents and was escaping with Amy, he was accidentally shot in the back by a friend who was also an agent. Fortunately, Brad managed to create chaos and shook off the agents chasing him, and even stole a car to escape with Amy. But due to excessive blood loss, after driving to the suburbs, Brad passed out. In this middle of nowhere, the anxious Amy could only pick up Brad's phone and call his most recent contact. The person who answered the call was Lisa. Upon learning that Brad was injured, Lisa was also very worried. She told Amy to give Brad first aid according to her instructions. With Lisa's help, Brad finally regained consciousness. The moment he saw Amy holding the phone, Brad quickly smashed the phone, threw it away, and drove off. Because his phone had long been installed with a tracker by the laboratory, once the phone was turned on, the laboratory staff would track them down. Shortly after the two left, the laboratory staff arrived nearby, but by then, Brad had already taken Amy to Mary's house. Mary was Brad's former instructor. When Mary saw Brad's wanted notice, she had already guessed that he would come to her for help. In the afternoon, while Brad was resting, the alarm outside the door went off again. Brad quickly picked up his pistol and went to the door to check, only to find that it was his ex-wife Lisa who had arrived. The two hugged each other emotionally. In the evening, after Lisa gave Brad a simple wound treatment, they rested at Mary's house for the night. The next day, Mary took out the equipment she had prepared in advance to help Brad and the other two continue their escape. But just as Brad and the others were about to leave, the alarm sounded outside. The agents had already caught up. Mary told Brad to take Amy and the others and leave first, while she stayed behind to hold the agents off. But there were far too many agents outside. Mary couldn't handle them all and was hit and injured in an instant. Brad also knew that they had reached the limit of their escape. He told Lisa to take Amy and escape through the back door. While he walked outside, laid down his weapon, and surrendered, his friend pressed him for Amy's whereabouts. Brad refused to admit that Amy was there. Unable to bear seeing Brad suffer alone, Amy let go of Lisa's hand and ran to the gate. Both of them were taken away in a car. On the other side, two new orderlies in the laboratory were fooling around. Jerry kicked John's employee ID card into the cage where the test subject was held. John carefully retrieved his ID card, but was mocked by his colleague Jerry. Jerry said that these test subjects had no consciousness. Seeing John's look of disbelief, Jerry deliberately stuck his head near the cage to provoke test subject 11, Helen, who was locked inside. Helen suddenly lashed out and bit Jerry's neck. It was the first time a test subject had attacked an orderly inside the laboratory. This caught the attention of Professor Jason, the leader of Project Noah. He discovered that Helen's brainwaves were unusually active when she attacked the orderly, far exceeding the fluctuation speed of a normal person. Besides this, Jason also discovered that orderly Jerry often bullied Helen, which might also be the reason why Helen lashed out. Out of concern for the safety of others in the laboratory, Kate and Jason decided to destroy test subject 11, but Professor Park disagreed with their decision. After all, they had finally seen hope in Helen, and if they destroyed her now, all their previous efforts would be in vain. However, Jason had far higher authority than Professor Park. Helen was ultimately sent to the disposal room. The staff locked Helen in a transparent chamber, then activated a strong light with ultraviolet rays. The moment the light hit Helen's body, she let out a heart-wrenching scream. It turned out that these test subjects injected with the new cells were extremely afraid of intense ultraviolet rays. Once exposed to the light, their cells would die rapidly. During the disposal process, fragmented memories flashed through Helen's mind. It turned out that Helen was an extremely poor girl. Her biological family was not a happy one. After her mother remarried, she moved to her stepfather's house with her mother, but her stepfather was a beast. He even violated the young Helen. Helen went to her mother to cry and beg her to take her away from this monster, but she never expected that her mother would not only refuse to help her, but also take the stepfather's side. In a fit of rage, Helen killed her mother and stepfather, and was therefore sentenced to death, then sent to the laboratory. She even narrowly escaped being violated by an orderly because of her good looks. After being injected with the new cells and virus, Helen gradually began to lose her sense of self, which made the orderly even more ruthless, often beating her with a stick. The long-term physical abuse made Helen harbor resentment towards the orderly, so when the orderly provoked her, she launched an attack. Somehow, Captain Kate sensed Helen's memories. Helen's screams also became particularly piercing. He used his authority to stop the execution, wanting to figure out what these inexplicable memory fragments were about. At the same time, Brad and Amy were also taken back to the laboratory. Catherine originally wanted to comfort Amy and persuade her to cooperate well with the experiment, but Amy was very resistant. Catherine found Brad and told him what the laboratory was researching. After learning that the laboratory was developing an antivirus vaccine, Brad's resolve began to waver. He found Amy and told her about the new virus. After learning that the experiment conducted on her might save all of humanity, Amy was no longer so resistant. Catherine also promised that she would ensure Amy's safety. After Amy's mood stabilized, Catherine gave Amy the first injection, while Brad took advantage of everyone's inattention to steal some tools needed for the injection. Right after the injection, Amy felt dizzy and soon lay down on the bed and fell asleep. Brad thought it must be due to the fatigue from the past 2 days of traveling, so he lay down on the sofa and also fell asleep. In a semi-conscious state, Brad saw orderly John walk into the room. He initially thought John had come to take Amy away, but John only said that test subject 0 would come to find Amy. After saying that, he stumbled and ran away. Brad quickly chased after him, but he didn't catch up with John. Instead, he ran into test subject 12. Aaron was ventilating at the door of the room. He had only been injected recently and was still in a completely normal state. Brad tried to get some information about the experiment out of Aaron, but Aaron didn't know much either. He told Brad that since he was injected with the cell virus, he had been constantly dreaming of a man named Fanning, but he had never met this man before. Brad felt that this experiment was somewhat strange. To find out the truth, he took advantage of the staff member named John being unprepared, and used the stolen anesthetic to knock him unconscious, dragged him over to use his eye scan to open the door, and took his access card to go to the underground laboratory, and happened to run straight into test subject 0. Brad was shocked. Test subject 0 was none other than Professor Fanning. Compared to his appearance before being infected, Professor Fanning had now turned into a terrifying monster. There were more than a dozen other test subjects in this laboratory, all of whom would become like Professor Fanning. Just then, Professor Jason walked over. Seeing that Brad had violated the rules and come to the underground laboratory, he didn't sound the alarm, but instead told Brad about Professor Fanning. After learning that the cells in Professor Fanning's body could be immune to so many deadly viruses, Brad found it incredible, but when he thought of Professor Fanning's appearance just now, he still felt a lingering fear to prevent Amy from becoming like that in the future. The next day, Brad decided that he still needed to find a chance to take Amy away. This experiment was far too dangerous, and Amy shouldn't be dragged into it. Taking advantage of the break time for fresh air, Brad took Amy to the rooftop of the treehouse. He planned to first observe the surrounding terrain, but just at this moment, the armed police officer in charge of guarding the laboratory suddenly shot at a colleague patrolling below. Before the laboratory staff could counterattack, the out-of-control armed police officer lifted his gun again and aimed at the nearby power switch. The next second, a huge explosion was heard, and all the power supplies in the laboratory were forcibly cut off along with the explosion. At the same time, Aaron, who had completed the third phase of the experiment, underwent an abnormal transformation. Professor Jason had originally wanted to record this abnormal transformation to verify some hypotheses with the results of this time, but due to the sudden power outage of the equipment, his experiment was forced to be suspended. Fortunately, there was a backup power supply in the basement. While Jason was waiting for the staff to start the backup power, Aaron on the side suddenly woke up and attacked the staff. Fortunately, Jason reacted quickly, activated the safety lock, and locked Aaron up. But when he left the laboratory, Jason had blood on his body. Since no one knew whose blood it was that was on Jason's body, Catherine planned to only quarantine Jason temporarily for further observation. On the other side, Kate killed the out-of-control armed police officer and completed the circuit repair quickly. This time, the armed police officer's out-of-control behavior and the sudden power outage made Jason feel a faint sense of unease. He felt that all of this was too coincidental, as if someone was afraid that he would research out effective data. But who on earth would stop him from developing the vaccine? This is a research project to save all of humanity. No one should stop it, after all. But when he saw test subject 0, Fanning, not far away, a bold and terrifying conjecture took shape in Jason's mind. After the laboratory was attacked, personnel from the U.S. Department of Defense arrived soon. It turned out that this biological laboratory had always been led by the U.S. Department of Defense behind the scenes. Catherine reported the matter of the test subject's abnormal transformations to the Secretary of Defense. Out of safety concerns, Catherine applied to suspend the experiment to first figure out the reason for the test subject's outbursts. Besides this, Catherine had another important discovery, that is, although the brainwaves of the test subjects are slow, it doesn't mean their consciousness is dull. It is highly possible that they don't use their brains to communicate, because when Helen attacked the orderly, the laboratory detected a faint brainwave, and just now, when Aaron underwent his abnormal transformation, this kind of brainwave appeared again. This is definitely not a coincidence. But Catherine didn't expect that after the secretary heard her latest discovery, the secretary actually wanted to increase investment in Project Noah, and requested Catherine to figure out quickly what that brainwave represents. It turned out that to deal with international conflicts, the Department of Defense planned to develop some special weapons. If they could figure out why these test subjects can be controlled, wouldn't that be equivalent to having a group of ferocious legions? And Catherine was not the only one who had discovered this brainwave. Professor Park had actually discovered this brainwave a long time ago, and had already made research findings. Upon hearing this, the secretary decided to let Professor Park focus on researching the brainwave, while Catherine continued to be in charge of developing the vaccine. With the secretary's approval, Professor Park immediately brought test subject 3 to the laboratory and installed the same brainwave receiving device on his own temples and the test subject's temples. As the device was activated, Professor Park tried to issue movement commands to test subject 3, watching test subject 3 slowly lift its left hand under his command. Professor Park was extremely excited and went to find the secretary to show his research results, but after the secretary arrived at the laboratory, the control method Professor Park had used just now no longer worked. The secretary stood up angrily and left. Professor Park thought it was because the frequency he had adjusted was incorrect, but just as he was readjusting it, test subject 3 broke free from the restraints of the experimental chair. Professor Park looked at test subject 3 in disbelief and demanded to know how it had unlocked the restraints. Test subject 3 told him that it only needed to use its own imagination. Realizing something was wrong, Professor Park turned around and ran, but his speed could not match that of the test subject. Professor Park had just run to the door when test subject 3 bit his neck in one bite. Professor Park, who had been showing off his achievements to the secretary just 1 second, became a mummified corpse drained of blood the next. It turned out that the test subjects had always had consciousness. They had just been controlling it themselves to prevent the biologists from noticing clues, and also to make them lower their guard, and the one who had told them to do this was test subject 0, Professor Fanning. Unaware of this drastic change, the secretary was meeting with the latest test subject, Amy, asking if she had experienced any changes recently. It turned out that Jason had made a new discovery in his previous research. The test subjects seemed to possess telepathic abilities, and could peer into others' mental activities through brainwaves. The reason the orderlies had nightmares was also because they were affected by this power. Jason and Professor Park had studied the brainwaves of each test subject, hoping to find clues through data comparison. He had originally planned to conduct in-depth research through Aaron, but an accident occurred in the laboratory, and Professor Park had also told the secretary about this matter, which was why the secretary had sought out Amy. Amy shook her head and said that she had only just completed the second phase of injections and didn't yet have these strange abilities. Although Amy denied it verbally, the secretary still detected something unusual. Catherine couldn't stand the secretary's intense questioning of Amy any longer. Catherine made an excuse and took Amy out of the room. Later, she also took Amy and Brad out of the laboratory. Catherine felt scared by the secretary's almost crazy experiments. She was afraid that if Project Noah continued, everyone would turn into monsters, so she decided to help Amy and Brad escape. But they had just walked out of the laboratory when they ran into the escaping test subject 3. Test subject 3 immediately pounced on Brad. Seeing Brad fall to the ground, Amy screamed in fear. Surprisingly, her scream had an offensive effect on the test subject, directly knocking test subject 3 flying. Brad was surprised by Amy's ability, but this wasn't the right time to ask about it. On the other side, upon learning that the test subject had attacked the laboratory, Catherine immediately activated the laboratory's alarm and asked Kate to lead the military to seal off the laboratory, and Amy successfully escaped under the military's cover. But they searched the entire laboratory and couldn't find any trace of test subject 3. Finally, they found in the surveillance video that test subject 3 had escaped through the ventilation duct. This was a big problem. No one knew how many people this monster would kill if it was let loose outside. Moreover, test subject 3 still carried the new virus injected by the laboratory in its body. The secretary ordered the seal-off of the area around the laboratory, but for the sake of concealment, the laboratory had been built in an area surrounded by forests, making it extremely difficult to find test subject 3 here. However, Amy could sense test subject 3's location. She told everyone that test subject 3 had escaped to a house. A group of people hurried towards the house described by Amy. The agents immediately surrounded the house. When the agents burst into the house, they saw Brad's ex-wife Lisa confronting the frantic house owner. Kate immediately killed the house owner and asked Lisa what was going on. It turned out that after Brad was arrested, Lisa was extremely worried and decided to come and check in person. But on the way, she encountered test subject 3 attacking a passerby. In a panic, Lisa went to a roadside house to ask for help, but unexpectedly, as soon as she arrived at the house, she saw test subject 3 attacking the house owner. After test subject 3 left, Lisa wanted to check on the house owner's condition, but the house owner came back to life, and even the wound on his neck had disappeared. However, the resurrected house owner underwent a drastic change in temperament and rushed over to bite Lisa. Fortunately, the laboratory staff arrived in time. Otherwise, Lisa would have been in danger of losing her life. But from this, it seems that the viral cells carried by the test subjects can spread through biting. Therefore, it is now necessary to catch test subject 3 as soon as possible. Amy activated her sensing ability again, and sensed that test subject 3 had run to the nearby water pumping station. Kate hurriedly led the military to the scene. But as soon as they arrived at the water pumping station, everyone was shocked, because a large number of infected people had already appeared in the water pumping station. Fortunately, the reinforcement troops Kate brought were sufficient, and the infected people were quickly cleared out. Test Subject 3 still wanted to escape, but dawn had already broken outside. Test subjects can't move under ultraviolet light, but when he saw Amy not far away, Test Subject 3 seemed to sense something. He rushed towards Amy regardless of the burning from the ultraviolet rays. In a panic, Amy ran into an abandoned factory. Test Subject 3 followed closely behind. Meanwhile, Brad seized the opportunity to open a nearby rolling shutter door, and took down Test Subject 3 using the sunlight that came in. At the same time, all the infected people in the water pumping station also lost their ability to move. It turned out that there was actually a symbiotic relationship between the infected people and their parent test subject. While Kate was leading her team to clean up the scene, they received an alarm from the laboratory. It turned out that just now, another accident had occurred in the laboratory. After several days of observation, Professor Jason was released from the isolation room. As soon as he came out, he went to visit his wife, but his wife, who had originally been physically disabled and had Alzheimer's disease, had actually recovered during the period when Jason was in isolation. Before Jason could even feel happy, he saw a syringe on the side. It turned out that Jason's wife Ellie had been classmates with Professor Fanning. Fanning had always admired Ellie, but Ellie had finally married Jason. Even though Ellie was already married, Fanning had never given up his feelings for her. Later, Ellie became physically disabled and also developed Alzheimer's disease. In order to cure his wife's illness, Jason had researched many projects over the years, but had never been able to achieve effective results, until 3 years ago. Jason and Fanning both received news at the same time, learning that there were miraculous cells in the cave in Bolivia that might be able to cure Ellie, but unexpectedly, they not only failed to catch the monster, but Fanning also turned into an infected person. It was precisely because of this accident that Project Noah came into existence. Jason had also been wanting to use the virus to cure his wife, but the experiment went wrong at the most critical moment. Fanning, after being infected, sensed Ellie's condition. In order to prevent Ellie from being taken away by the illness like this, he controlled orderly John with his own willpower, and told John to inject his own blood into Ellie. This is why Ellie recovered. But even though his wife was now in good health, Jason deeply knew this was only temporary. Before long, his wife would undergo an abnormal transformation, and turn into a terrifying-looking infected person, and might even bring chaos to society. Jason would never allow such a thing to happen. He told Ellie about the dangers of the cells. After learning about the danger of the cells in her body, Ellie, who was also a scientist, only said, "No matter what Jason wants to do, I will support him unconditionally." After getting Ellie's approval, Jason went to the laboratory, preparing to destroy all the test subjects. Fanning, who sensed the crisis, didn't say a word and only stared at Jason. As the ultraviolet lamps were turned on, the test subjects let out painful roars. But just at this moment, Catherine rushed to the laboratory and stopped Jason, telling him that the infected would perish along with the parent test subject, and even Amy was no exception, and that she had just discovered Amy had genes different from those of the other test subjects, which might become the key to making a breakthrough in vaccine research. If all the test subjects are destroyed now, we will really have no way out. After listening to Catherine's explanation, Jason hurriedly turned off the ultraviolet equipment. But it was precisely this decision that would bring a devastating disaster to the world. Due to the frequent accidents in the laboratory, Catherine and Jason were dismissed by the secretary. Even Captain Kate's position was replaced by an agent named Achiao. After narrowly escaping death under the intense light last time, the test subjects also began to become restless, asking Fanning when he would take everyone to escape. But Fanning said the time wasn't right yet. In fact, Fanning had been trying to communicate with Ellie. The test subject's escape plan couldn't do without Ellie's help and support. He told Ellie that he would use the new cells to enable further human evolution, and that humans at that time would not only be immune to all diseases, but also have a longer lifespan. But Ellie clearly knew that once all humans turned into monsters like Fanning, the world would be doomed. In the face of Ellie's determination, Fanning stopped trying to persuade her, and Ellie, who had lost the parent test subject's consciousness, soon fell into illness again. Looking at his wife who was in great pain, Jason removed his wife's oxygen tube. On the other side, the comatose Amy had not yet woken up. The secretary was worried that Amy would undergo a mutation, and sent her to the laboratory, and arbitrarily decided to change the vaccine research to biochemical weapon research. The previous laboratory staff were also dismissed by the secretary. The staff who had lost access to the laboratory were all transferred to the ground floor to wait for transfer orders. After learning about the secretary's latest plan, Kate found the secretary, and told him that when she was leading the military to hunt down test subject 3, she discovered that the test subjects might be secretly plotting something. It is extremely dangerous for the secretary to have dismissed a large number of security personnel now. But the secretary had become obsessed, only thinking about using biochemical weapons to resolve international conflicts. regardless of what kind of impact the experiment would bring. Just as he was about to leave, Brad took the secretary hostage, and used the secretary's authority to go to the underground laboratory. Catherine followed closely behind, turned on the computer, and recombined Amy's genes. It turned out that Catherine had already discovered that Amy's immune cells could resist the virus carried by Fanning, but at the same time, Fanning also invaded Amy's consciousness through brainwaves. In fact, since Amy's first injection, Fanning had been trying to communicate with Amy, wanting to make her a pawn in his own plan as well, but for some reason, this girl was actually harder to win over than the others. He didn't know that at such a young age, Amy had already witnessed the darkness of human nature in the slums, so she wouldn't easily trust anyone. In the face of the highly vigilant Amy, Fanning also chose not to forcibly persuade her but to leave temporarily. After Fanning left Amy's consciousness, Amy woke up soon, seeing that Amy had not undergone any abnormal changes. Brad was about to unlock her handcuffs but was stopped by Amy. She said that she had already met Fanning, and could undergo abnormal changes at any time. Meanwhile, Captain Kate found that Orderly John had gone to the communication room. What was an orderly like him doing in the communication room? Kate thought something was wrong with John and quietly followed him, and found that John was actually destroying the communication equipment, and the person who had instigated him to do this was Fanning again. Kate hurriedly reported this matter to the secretary, because entering the communication room requires extremely high authority, something neither John nor Fanning could do, unless one of them is a mole for the test subjects, and the most suspicious among them is Achio, the newly appointed person who had replaced Kate. But what surprised everyone was that Achio had not yet arrived at the biological laboratory. Since receiving the transfer order, how could he have assigned authority? But the secretary said that Achio had been in the laboratory all along. What is going on here? He took the secretary to the area where the test subjects were detained, and found that Achio was actually test subject 2. It turned out that since the secretary entered the laboratory, he had been targeted by test subject 2. Test subject 2 had entered the secretary's subconscious through brainwaves, just like Fanning controlled the orderly, and gained the secretary's trust. The secretary hurriedly revoked Achio's authority, but obviously they were still one step too late. Taking advantage of the time when Kate and the secretary were away, John untied the rope that bound him, and walked towards the underground laboratory. At the same time, Catherine, who had finally synthesized the new cells, prepared 2 doses of antidote to inject into Amy. But the door leading to Amy's room had already been locked from the inside by John. Fanning took advantage of this gap to invade Amy's consciousness once again. Amy was extremely weak at this moment, and under Fanning's seduction, her will began to waver. Fanning told Amy to ride a bicycle through the tunnel right in front of her. As long as she passed through this tunnel, Amy would become the same kind of being as Fanning. Amy rode her bicycle slowly forward in the tunnel but stopped halfway. It turned out that when Fanning invaded her subconscious mind, she had also invaded Fanning's subconscious mind. Amy had a strong sense of anti-reconnaissance. Through Fanning's subconscious mind, she learned about the conspiracy Fanning was plotting, then turned around and left the tunnel. The moment she returned, Amy also woke up and told Brad that Fanning wanted to destroy the current world and create a world with only mutants. After learning the truth, Brad hurriedly took Amy and prepared to escape, but by this time, John had already used the authority he had obtained from the secretary to open the cages, and all the other test subjects had escaped from the cages. Brad hurriedly closed the laboratory's gate, but he was afraid that such a single gate couldn't stop the test subjects. Moreover, during the escape, Brad also found Catherine, who had been locked up by John, but he didn't have the laboratory's authority, and couldn't open the door that locked Catherine in. Just at this moment, a sound came from above Brad's head. It turned out that a test subject had crossed the gate through the ventilation duct. To protect Amy's safety, Brad could only take everyone to evacuate first, but as soon as they turned around, they were surrounded by the infected. Lisa was even bitten in the chaos. Fortunately, Brad was an agent by background, and there were not many infected people around. He quickly eliminated these mutants and took everyone to the elevator entrance, and entrusted Lisa to Amy. Before going back to rescue Catherine, on the ground floor, Kate also learned the news that the test subjects had escaped. He immediately blocked the exit, but the secretary selfishly wanted to activate the laboratory's self-destruct program. Kate persuaded the secretary to wait a little longer, saying that Catherine had already developed a drug to control the virus. Catherine was still in the laboratory now, and if the laboratory blew up, all the research would be in vain. At the same time, Catherine had just pried open the door. She was about to escape when she ran into Helen. Fortunately, Brad arrived in time and fired a shot to scare Helen away. But looking at the large number of infected people swarming in the corridor, both of them knew they couldn't stay here too long. Upstairs, the secretary had already lost his patience for waiting, afraid that the test subjects would escape and cause chaos to the outside world, and even more afraid that his superiors would reprimand him for his dereliction of duty. He stubbornly wanted to activate the self-destruct program, but Kate wanted to wait for Brad and Catherine to come out, so the two got into a fight. However, Amy walked to the computer and activated the self-destruct program. Amy knew well how terrifying Fanning was. If Fanning was allowed to escape, the world would be doomed. The moment the self-destruct program was activated, Fanning also realized something was wrong. He immediately told the test subjects to start looking for an exit. Meanwhile, Kate remembered there was a ventilation shaft in the laboratory, and the shaft opening was in the area where Brad was currently located. Under Kate's guidance, Brad found the sealed ventilation shaft. Just as the two were about to leave, infected people appeared behind them. Catherine handed the antidote to Brad and told him to leave quickly with it. She decided to stay behind to deal with the aftermath. The self-destruct program had already entered the countdown. Brad didn't hesitate. He climbed out of the ventilation shaft with the antidote. And as soon as he climbed out of the opening, the laboratory was engulfed in flames. He didn't have time to think further, and injected Lisa with the antidote immediately. Lisa woke up soon after, and she found that she had gained extremely strong self-healing ability, yet she wouldn't be controlled by Fanning. Catherine's research had finally paid off. Brad was eager to take the other dose of antidote to Professor Jason. He turned around and was stunned. The guards at the door were already dead, and the outside was full of infected people. It turned out that the laboratory's self-destruction had only destroyed the lab itself. The test subjects had instead escaped amid the chaos, and quickly assimilated the people around them. Kate turned on the searchlight, and led the surviving team members to cover Amy's escape. But how could Fanning let Amy get away? As soon as they walked out of the house, they were attacked by the infected. Kate was even knocked flying several meters by Aaron. His spine was broken on the spot, and he lost the ability to move. Helen walked over to Kate and squatted down. She didn't kill Kate. Instead, she chose to assimilate him. Because Kate had saved her life when the laboratory decided to destroy her earlier, she couldn't help Kate return to his original state, but at least she could free Kate from pain. The situation for Brad and Amy was also not optimistic. They had just run into a forest when Amy was intercepted by Fanning. Fanning grabbed Amy by the neck, preparing to get rid of this biggest obstacle to himself, because Amy had too many uncertain factors that would greatly affect his plan. But just as Amy's life was hanging by a thread, Fanning foresaw a scene from the future. He saw himself lying under a tree, on the verge of death, with a desolate landscape all around. In a trance, a figure walked towards him and fed him a mouthful of blood. And that figure was Amy when she grew up. Fanning let go of the hand that was choking Amy and looked at her thoughtfully, then left the forest. Brad soon caught up as well. After confirming Amy was safe, they found a car and prepared to head to the CDC, but they had underestimated just how fast the virus was spreading. In just one night, the entire city had become a territory of the infected. He took Amy and the other survivors to hide in the nearby forest, waiting for rescue from the CDC. But what they waited for was the infected suddenly breaking into the camp. Brad was unfortunately bitten. The other two survivors decided to kill Brad to survive, but they let their guard down around Amy. Amy suddenly lashed out and killed the two survivors, then picked up the last dose of antidote and injected it into Brad. It turned out that Amy had not escaped the mutation. She had been trying her best to control herself just to keep Brad from worrying. By the time Brad woke up, Amy was already gone. And since Jason had not received the antidote, he couldn't produce a virus inhibitor. The virus spread wider and wider, and soon the entire United States was overrun by the infected. To prevent the virus from spreading to other countries, countries around the world discussed and decided to drop nuclear bombs on the United States to put an end to this terrifying virus. But what no one expected, under the nuclear bomb attack, the United States nuclear missile system was also activated, launching nuclear bombs at the whole world. The nuclear bomb plan not only failed to eliminate the virus, but also turned humanity's home into ruins, causing the virus to spread across the globe. Several years later, the surviving humans built a massive shelter on Earth, and everyone could only eke out a living inside the shelter. Outside the shelter's towering walls stood a tall and straight young woman. It was Amy, all grown up. And would she become the key to turning the world around? That's the entire content of The Passage. The Passage, a sci-fi horror series released in 2019, stands out among numerous doomsday-themed works, with its unique narrative perspective and profound emotional core. Adapted from Justin Cronin's best-selling trilogy of novels, the series takes viewers into a doomsday world, triggered by an out-of-control scientific experiment. But it doesn't stop at showcasing horror and destruction. Instead, it delves into exploring the power of emotional bonds between people in extreme environments. The Passage transcends the framework of traditional horror series. It doesn't content itself with attracting viewers with terrifying creatures, but instead explores multi-layered themes in depth. Through the experiences of death row inmates who turn into bloodthirsty monsters, the series subtly criticizes animal testing and the inhumane treatment of criminals in the real world. Most of these monsters are death row inmates who underwent biochemical experiments to delay their execution, essentially victims who were pushed to desperation. In the series, a scientist, looking at his imprisoned friend who has turned into a mindless creature, wonders if he's still inside his body. I hope I can find him. This exploration of remaining humanity adds philosophical depth to the series, making viewers can't help but ponder the inner world of monsters. The ultimate value of the passage lies in the fact that it showcases the brilliance of humanity blooming against a backdrop of despair, just as a character in the series says, anger is a poison, and you should be able to do whatever you want with your life. That's not my opinion, it's a fact. This survival philosophy full of pacifism and positive thinking forms an invisible struggle with the despair that envelopes the world. With the high pressure of the zombie crisis throughout the play, it makes us believe that even in the darkest moments, the flame of humanity can still burn, and the power of love can still guide us forward. This series is not just a visually thrilling doomsday adventure, but more importantly, an emotional journey that touches the soul, worthy of being savored carefully by every viewer who enjoys in-depth genre works.